Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about prompting. We've been working through some of our parent modules to better know how to teach and work with our children. So we thought we'd take this opportunity just to review some of the prompting strategies that can help you when you're teaching your child. So when we talk about prompting, we're talking about a strategy or tool used to transition the learner from responding incorrectly or not knowing how to perform a skill to responding correctly. So prompting is a great tool to use because it can increase how often a student responds. It can lower their frustration. We don't want to have our learners be unsuccessful. We want them to contact being able to perform the skill and access reinforcement. So prompting is really good for that. And it also helps the child learn things more efficiently. There are all different kinds of prompts. There are prompts which are physical, so that includes full physical prompting, partial physical prompting, and then different levels in there. Modeling, so demonstrating how to do a skill. Gestural prompts, so some kind of point or gesture to help the learner respond correctly. There's verbal prompts, and then there's visual prompts. And this includes where we're placing materials, different visuals, things like that. According to literature, and if you think about these different prompts, a full physical, so hand over hand or helping your child physically perform a skill, is more intrusive than using some kind of visual. So on this diagram, there's the arrows showing most intrusive to least invasive prompting procedures. So one thing I just want to talk about is verbal prompts. Physical prompts, gestural, and modeling prompts are a lot easier to fade. Even though verbal prompts might not be as intrusive as some of the physical prompts, we have to consider our child's strengths. So a lot of our kiddos are very visual and have deficits in their language. So using a verbal prompt might not necessarily occasion a correct response. Verbal prompts are also really hard to fade. If kids are dependent on us giving directions or telling them the answer, it's really hard to fade that back. Whereas if we're physically prompting them or giving them a model, it's easy to subtly fade those back so that the child can eventually respond to the natural environment. Verbal prompts, again, it's hard to fade and it can create that prompt dependency. So often if people use verbal prompts, we see students then turning towards the instructor to get that verbal prompt to be dependent on that. So we want to make sure that if we are using verbal prompts, we're talking to our teachers and we really have a plan to how to fade that. So this is kind of just a warning on using those verbal prompts and maybe choosing, a physical or a gestural prompt, maybe even some kind of visual instead. Really important thing to remember when you're prompting is that definition of prompting. So prompts occasion and help students do things successfully on the way to eventually doing the skill independently. So a verbal prompt is not repeating the direction, because if a child doesn't follow the direction the first time, just by repeating it, we're not going to occasion that correct response. So really make sure that when we're using prompts, we're following that, ABCs of behavior paradigm. And I'll show you in a couple slides where to implement those prompts. So when to prompt. Here's just the diagram of that traditional ABC learning format. So when we're teaching a skill, we deliver some kind of antecedent or cue to perform the skill. Student behaves, and then there's some kind of consequence. So whether that's reinforcement in the form of verbal praise or some kind of preferred activity or item, or just the natural consequences of the environment. So, I'm told to put this puzzle together. I really enjoy doing puzzles. It's naturally reinforcing. I put the puzzle together and the consequence is it's complete. I did it. That's maybe naturally reinforcing. An example down here of that antecedent behavior consequence relationship is maybe you're working on body parts and you tell your child, okay, touch your head. Child touches the head, and then we let them know, like, great job, awesome. So in this ABC sequence, there's a couple different places to prompt. You could prompt right away with that antecedent. So for the example of touching head, I might say, okay, touch your head, and touch my head and give that model prompt right along with that antecedent. If I'm teaching, my child to spell their name, I might give the antecedent, spell your name by pointing to a model of how they spell their name. So delivering that prompt as soon as you deliver that antecedent or that direction. Sometimes we do a prompt right after the antecedent. So we allow the student a little bit of time to respond, and then we prompt them. So if I was, again, asking the student to spell their name, I might allow them to do it independently, wait 2 seconds, which is a time delay, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then show them the model or start it off for them. And then there are times that we might implement the prompt after the behavior. So let's say a student is washing their hands, they walk to the sink, they turn on the water, but they start to play in the water. They're behaving, but after that behavior that's incorrect, I might prompt them to do the response correctly. It's really important to pick where you're going to implement a prompt proactively so that our students, we're consistent for our students, and the prompting procedure can be systematic and fated appropriately. So I can't stress enough the importance of prompt fading. Again, with all the skills we're teaching our children, the goal is independence. So what I would do is I would talk to your child's teacher about what kinds of prompts can be used to teach certain skills. What kind of prompts do we use in the classroom to teach those activities of daily living? Unpacking, packing up, dressing, washing hands, routines, and then talk to them about how you might systematically fade that. And then what kind of responding do we want to see before we take away that gestural or visual prompt? Talk to your teacher about all those things. There are a bunch of different ways to implement prompting procedures. So there's something called least to most prompting, where we're going to let the child try the skill independently and use a less intrusive prompt. So we might use a visual for hand washing, and then we might move to a gestural, so showing them how to do it. We might do some modeling, and then if they're still not getting it, that's when we move into some of those physical prompts. Least to most prompting is okay when students are pretty solid in the skill and maybe understand all of the steps but just need practice working on them. A lot of the times we like to use most to least prompts, so kids are getting a lot of support first and then gradually fading it back. The reason we like most to least is it gives the student a high rate of success in the beginning and then fading towards that independence. Another type of prompt is called a time delay. This is when you allow a student to respond and you're counting in your head a specific amount of time before you help them. So in the picture here, we have a little girl putting on her shoes. We might allow her maybe 5 seconds to do it independently. So we let her know, okay, put on your shoes. We're counting in our head, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Whatever she did independently, then we're going to help her for the rest. Again, this time delay allows us to be more systematic with how we're teaching. So we're doing things the same way every time to promote that independence. And the last type of prompt is called graduated guidance. And this is for physical skills only, where you're providing some support with some kind of partial or full physical prompt, and then gradually releasing that guidance. Some reminders with prompts: you really want to make sure that you are avoiding unintentional prompts, such as positioning materials or pointing to something when you don't think about it. Sometimes the way we say things is controlling behavior more than what we say. Facial expression, eye gazes, not changing the order of the way you teach things, all those things can function as prompts. An example of this would be teaching a child their sight words, and those sight words are on a ring, and the ring is in the same order every time. What might happen is the order might prompt the student to respond, not actually the word. So making sure we change up orders, we change up presentations, we change up our inflection when we're giving directions, all those things are really important to make sure that our student isn't dependent on an unintentional prompt. You want to make sure that you, again, just on, like we talked about on that when to prompt slide, that we're prompting as soon as possible and the same way every time. What we don't want is students to get into the pattern of responding incorrectly. So if it's not possible to prompt simultaneously with the instruction, then just like on that when slide, we have it right after the instruction. Our kids are learning a lot of tough skills and they're not going to be independent right away. So it's okay to reinforce prompted responses, which is, important. But we don't want the reinforcement for a prompted response to be the same as an independent. So maybe if I need to assist my student with washing hands and we prompt them, we might deliver verbal praise after saying, thank you for washing our hands. But, if we are working on washing hands and our student does it independently and beautifully, at the end, we want that reinforcer to be more. So it might be verbal praise with a high five, and then time to play with a preferred toy. Remember, our kids are learning all the time. If they're not learning the right way, then they're learning to either not respond or to do it incorrectly. So it's really important to make sure that if our students are not responding correctly, then we're prompting them. And another thing is again, we're working towards that independence. So we want to make sure that we fade the prompts gradually.